Welcome back to Government 148, Politics and Government of the Middle East. We have pretty much reached the end of the course, and my last lectures are going to be on a topic with which Middle East has been associated pretty closely, and that's terrorism. So in this lecture, I want to begin with talking about the political strategy of terrorists in general. And specifically, I want to talk about the terrorism emanating from organizations tied to the Middle East. So let me begin with talking about the political strategy of terrorism by pointing out the main actors. So the main actors would be the terrorist organization. So I'm going to start with some general theoretical points about the strategy of terrorism. And the primary target of terrorists are what we call the imperial power or the hegemon. So the imperial power, usually an external force, is viewed as the primary target, but relatedly, the secondary target of terrorist attack are the so-called vassal state, the client states associated with the imperial power. These are states that are not independent in a true sense of sovereignty. They are dependent states on the imperial power or the hegemon. So when we'll talk about the Middle East, in this case, the imperial power or the hegemon would be seen as the United States. Nowadays, before the United States, it used to be Britain. So that would be the application of it to the Middle East. And also the secondary or the client states are mostly the Arab states nowadays, mostly the Persian Gulf states, and also some of the monarchies that have had a close relationship with the United States. So I want to begin with the political strategy of the terrorists. And notice the phrase political. The word political is used here to talk about their political aims. And the political dimension of strategy in the terrorist organization is a very, very important raison d'etre, the justification for the terror act. So I want to begin by defining what exactly is a political strategy. So to define political strategy, I am defining it as manipulation of change to achieve the desired future state of affairs. In other words, change is occurring everywhere, whether you want it or not. The question is, how much control are you going to have over the change process, and how well you can manipulate it? Manipulate may be involving enhancing, speeding up the change, or reversing a trend, reinforcing a trend. So the term manipulation refers to any of these things that are intended to gain control over the process of change, and you want the control for the purpose of achieving your desired future state of affairs, because the change is going to unfold in some kind of an affair. The question is it going to be in the direction that you would want or not? Now, based on this definition, therefore, I am excluding a particular group of terrorists, for example, the anarchists. Really, for anarchists, there is no strategy involved. So as a political scientist, I have very little interest in them. For them, the means, the terror, the act of terror, the chaos that ensues is the end. In other words, there is no other higher ends for them. Also, it's important to exclude the specific motivations of those individuals who carry out acts of terror. For them, the act itself is the end. Oftentimes, this may very well reflect a personal revenge. So when you look at the 9/11 attacker, the head of the attackers was Muhammad Atta, and for him it was a very personal experience. And I had referred to Atta before when we talked about the Ghana bombing in the context of Israel and Palestinian. So for him, for example, the strategy really didn't extend much beyond his personal motive in all probability. Although I have to be cautioned here because there was a letter from Atta which has not been disclosed, and in it he may have actually come across as a genuine political strategist, but we certainly know there was personal motivation for Atta to undertake the 9/11 attack. So this is a very, very important part of it. Ultimately, though, we need to realize that change, when we talk about manipulation of change in the case of terrorism is equivalent to what I have said, a reaction to the shock from the terror attack. In other words, reaction, or really the induced reaction by the shock of the terror and subsequent rage that comes from the attack. And this will be a very, very important motivation for responding to terror attacks. So in many ways, what the purpose of terror, you will see, is to bring about a rage on the part of the target, which will then lead target to react. So in the next set of slides, I'm going to be talking a little bit in generalities, but then to give more meaning to my discussion, I will intersperse in my discussion the Middle East example so that the discussion will not appear overly abstract. So let me begin by noting that in terms of the terrorist political strategy, the act of terror, let's say, against the United States, was designed to provoke outrage on the part of the target. In this case, the target is regarded as the imperialist, and it's viewed as the hegemon, and also simultaneously it is an attack on one of the stereotypes that we discussed very early on in this course, and that is the colonial stereotype as held by the Muslim masses. Remember, the colonial stereotype is the view that the imperial masters are all-powerful, all-knowledgeable, and simply resisting them is a futile effort in the face of such overwhelming power. If you also recall, this was one of the stereotypes that was attacked by Ayatollah Khomeini with the taking of the American hostages. So the idea is, one of the things that the attack wants to accomplish is to show to the masses who are in the client state, who are in the dependent states, in other words, to the Muslim masses that are perceived to be in that position, to show them that the hegemon, the imperial power, is not all that powerful. In fact, the hegemon is very vulnerable. So these are the real goals of this. So here, to prove to the Muslim masses that the hegemon is indeed vulnerable, and also, given this sense of vulnerability, it's simultaneously designed to raise the sense of political efficacy on the part of the masses. So what does it mean to say to raise the sense of political efficacy of the masses? It simply means that they can do something about their fate. They could act and they could have results. And that was one of the aims of even terrorist strategy, to increase the sense of political efficacy on the part of the masses. So with that situation, what should happen next is that the outrage caused by the terror attack on the part of the target, in this case the hegemon, the imperial power, should then force an overreaction to the terror attack by that hegemon. So the US would be forced to overreact because it's being challenged. And this is a very, very important element of this strategy, because that overreaction by the hegemon should, at least in the best of possible situation, shift the worldwide focus away from the terrorists and onto the overreaction by the imperialists. So let me begin with that phase. So let's begin with the target's overreaction. And what happens here is that the overreaction would have an impact on the way the rest of the world will see the response, whether it's seen as legitimate or not. And this, in turn, if it's an overreaction, would lead to a sense of outrage in the client state, among the masses of the client state. So the Arab world, the Muslim world, would also be now outraged by the overreaction from the United States. At the same time, when that is happening, this overreaction should really put pressure on these client states that have been allied to the United States, because their masses are very unhappy with the United States overreaction, and should undermine the political position of these Arab states allied to the United States. Therefore, the outrage on the part of the Arab masses from the overreaction would put a lot of pressure on these states to modify their policy and perhaps even modify their relations with the United States, because they would be facing the risk of domestic rebellion against them. So you can see that this overreaction would put a lot of pressure on the clients of the United States. The overreaction by the United States would put a lot of pressure on the clients of the United States to modify their policy, to change their policy toward the United States, or in this case, the target of terrorists. And eventually, this could translate into a policy change, and even change in relations with the hegemon, with the US. In other words, you will see later on when I mention that when the United States decided to invade Iraq, the Arabs, most of them could not support the United States. And this paves the way for possibly regime change, because as the sense of efficacy rises, as the policy and relations begin to change, and as the client states of the United States begin to make concessions to the oppositions in the face of the United States overreaction, it could pave the way for a possible change even in the regime, and certainly in the client relations with the US. So eventually, if these regimes change, if the relations with the United States change, so the theory goes, then you will see that eventually the United States may realize that its relations are being damaged with this world, and it puts a lot of pressure on the United States to also change its policy toward the region. So the ultimate stage would be change in targets policy toward the region. So the United States would change its policy toward the region. So in a nutshell, this is the strategy. I'm not suggesting it will succeed. There are a number of obstacles in each of the stages that we have discussed, but ultimately the aim would be to bring about a change in United States policy toward the region, because it doesn't pay off. So terrorism is a way to convince the United States that its policy are too costly for its own good and for the good of the region.